The oil lamps cast dancing shadows across the worn floorboards of the Silver Dollar Saloon as the evening crowd settled into their usual rhythms. Tombstone in October carried a chill that seeped through the swinging doors each time a patron entered, bringing with it the scent of dust and dying mesquite from the desert beyond. At the center table, beneath the largest lamp, Diamond Jim Carver held court over a high-stakes poker game that had been running since noon. Carver was a man who demanded attention and usually got it. His black suit was tailored in San Francisco, complete with silver threading that caught the lamplight, and his vest sported a gold chain thick enough to anchor a small boat. Diamond pins decorated his silk tie, and his fingers bore rings on every digit save his trigger finger. That hand remained conspicuously bare, resting near the ivory-handled Remington at his hip. 3 other men sat at his table, local ranchers and merchants who had learned to fold early and often when Carver was running hot. The gambler's voice carried across the saloon as he raked in another substantial pot, his laugh booming over the general murmur of conversation. "You boys sure know how to make a man feel welcome in your fine town," he declared, stacking silver dollars with theatrical precision. "Though I have to say, the competition has been somewhat lacking. Perhaps Tombstone has grown too civilized for its own good." In the far corner, away from the main crowd, an old man sat alone at a small table, nursing a glass of whiskey that had barely been touched. His weathered face bore the deep lines that came from decades under the desert sun, and his gray hair hung long beneath a battered hat that had seen better years. Wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose as he appeared to study the amber liquid in his glass, though his pale blue eyes occasionally lifted to observe the poker game with quiet interest. His clothes marked him as a man of modest means. A simple cotton shirt, patched at the elbows, and denim trousers worn thin at the knees. His boots were scuffed leather that had walked countless miles, and his gun belt looked as old as he did, the leather cracked and faded to a dull brown. The holster held what appeared to be an equally ancient Colt revolver, its grip worn smooth by years of handling. Carver's attention eventually drifted to the solitary figure, and his eyes narrowed with the calculating look of a predator spotting easy prey. "Well now," he called out loudly enough for the entire saloon to hear, "looks like we have ourselves a genuine broken-down cowboy over there. Tell me, old-timer, you planning to sit there all night nursing that one drink? Or did you come in here to play cards like a man?" The elderly man looked up slowly, his pale eyes meeting Carver's gaze with calm steadiness. "I appreciate the invitation," he said quietly, his voice carrying the gravel of age and hard living. "Though I suspect my modest funds would hardly make for exciting stakes at your table." Carver's grin widened, showing teeth capped in gold. "Modest funds," he repeated with mock sympathy. "Well, that is refreshing honesty. Most men try to bluff their way into games beyond their means. But I suppose a fellow of your advanced years has learned the value of knowing his limitations." The comment drew chuckles from Carver's companions and a few nearby patrons, though others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The old man simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a reasonable observation, and returned his attention to his whiskey. His weathered hands remained perfectly steady as he lifted the glass to his lips. After nearly an hour of observing the game, the old man finally stood and approached Carver's table, reaching into his vest pocket to withdraw a small leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of silver coins. The conversation at nearby tables died down as patrons sensed something significant was about to unfold. The elderly cowboy moved with deliberate care, his steps measured and steady despite his apparent frailty. "Mind if I buy into your game?" he asked politely, settling his thin frame into the empty chair across from Carver. "I have about $20 that might provide some entertainment." Carver leaned back in his chair, studying the newcomer with obvious amusement. $20, he repeated slowly, as if the amount were so small as to be insulting. "Well, I suppose even pocket change can make things interesting. Boys, looks like we have ourselves a genuine relic from the old days joining our little gathering." The other players shifted nervously as the old man carefully counted out his stake, his weathered fingers handling the coins with practiced precision. His pale blue eyes remained focused on the task, seemingly unbothered by the snickers and whispered comments from around the table. When the cards were dealt for the first hand, he picked up his 5 cards with the same deliberate care he had shown with his money. For the next several hands, the elderly player demonstrated a conservative style that bordered on timid. He folded frequently, played only strong hands, and when he did win, it was always with solid, unspectacular cards. His modest pile of coins grew incrementally, nothing that would threaten the substantial stacks in front of Carver and his regular companions. The gambler seemed to lose interest, treating the old man as merely a source of occasional ontests to sweeten the pot. Then came the hand that changed everything. The old man had been dealt what appeared to be a mediocre collection of cards, but he stayed in the betting longer than usual, calling each of Carver's increasingly aggressive raises with quiet determination. When the final cards were revealed, his 3 sevens beat Carver's pair of kings, earning him a pot worth nearly $15. Carver's face darkened as he watched the old man gather the coins with the same methodical precision he had shown all evening. "Wait just a minute there, old-timer," the gambler said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "That was some mighty convenient luck you just had. Mind showing us how you managed to improve your hand so dramatically?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. Several patrons at nearby tables stopped their conversations entirely, while others began quietly moving toward the exit. The old man looked up from stacking his winnings, his pale eyes meeting Carver's hostile gaze with untroubled calm. "I played the cards I was dealt," he replied simply. "Same as everyone else at this table." Carver's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Same as everyone else," he repeated mockingly. "Well now, that is rich coming from someone who just happened to catch exactly the cards he needed. You know what I think, old man? I think you have been marking cards with those gnarled fingers of yours." The accusation was serious enough to warrant violence in any frontier saloon, and everyone present knew it. The bartender's hands moved nervously along the surface of the bar, while the piano player in the corner allowed his melody to fade into uncomfortable silence. Carver's 3 companions, sensing their leader's mood, began shifting their positions to flank the elderly player. The old man remained seated, his hands resting calmly on the table. "Son, you are making a mistake," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach Carver's ears. "I suggest you reconsider your accusation." Instead of heeding the warning, Carver exploded into action. His hands swept across the table, knocking over the old man's whiskey glass and sending amber liquid splashing across the felt surface. The glass shattered against the floor, the sound sharp and final in the sudden silence. "Reconsider," Carver snarled, rising to his full height and looming over the seated figure. "You decrepit old fool, the only thing I am reconsidering is whether to have you thrown out of here or beaten first and then thrown out. Nobody cheats Diamond Jim Carver and walks away to brag about it." The 3 men who had been playing at the table now stood as well, forming a semicircle behind their leader. They were not professional gunmen, but they were large men with hard faces and hands that had seen their share of violence. The message was clear without words being spoken. The old man was outnumbered and outgunned, facing odds that would intimidate men half his age and twice his apparent strength. But before we find out what happens next, if you are enjoying this tale of hidden legends and underestimated warriors, hit that like button and let us know you are here. And if you are not subscribed yet, make sure to join our community of story lovers. Comment below and tell us what state or country you are listening from. I love seeing how these stories of the American frontier reach people all around the world. Now stay with me because what comes next will remind you why respect was earned through actions, not words, in the Old West. The old man slowly rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the threatening presence surrounding him. His pale eyes swept over each of the 4 men facing him, taking their measure with the calm assessment of someone who had faced such situations before. When he spoke, his voice remained steady and quiet, but there was something in its tone that made several nearby patrons take another step toward the exit. "I have given you fair warning," he said, his weathered hands hanging loose at his sides. "What happens next is your choice to make." Carver's face flushed red with anger and wounded pride. "Fair warning," he spat, his voice rising to ensure everyone in the saloon could hear. "This broken-down saddle tramp thinks he can threaten Diamond Jim Carver. Boys, I think our new friend needs to learn some manners about respecting his betters." Without further warning, Carver's hand shot out and knocked the old man's battered hat from his head, sending it spinning across the sawdust-covered floor. The gesture was calculated humiliation, designed to strip away the last vestiges of the elderly cowboy's dignity in front of the entire saloon. "Tell you what, old-timer," Carver continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "I hear tell that back in your day, men settled disputes with iron instead of words. Course, looking at that ancient relic you are carrying, I would guess you might be just about the slowest draw left alive in the territory. Probably take you so long to clear leather that I could finish my drink, deal another hand, and still put 3 bullets in you before your gun saw daylight." Something fundamental shifted in the old man as Carver's insults echoed through the saloon. The change was subtle at first, visible only to those who knew what to look for. His shoulders, which had carried the stooped posture of advanced years, gradually straightened until his full height was revealed. The tremor that had seemed to affect his weathered hands disappeared entirely, leaving them steady as granite. Most striking of all were his eyes. Those pale blue orbs that had appeared roomy and unfocused now sharpened to the clarity of winter ice, cold and penetrating. In the corner booth where he had been quietly nursing a beer and reading a week-old newspaper, Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Bradley was young for a lawman, barely 25, but he had spent the last 3 years studying every wanted poster, every account of legendary gunfights, and every story that passed through the marshal's office. More importantly, his grandfather had been a Texas Ranger who had regaled him with tales of the great shootists from the previous generation. Bradley squinted through the smoky air, his trained eye picking up details that the average saloon patron would miss. The way the old man now stood with his weight perfectly balanced on both feet. The manner in which his right hand hung loose and ready at his side, fingers positioned just so above his holster. The cold, professional assessment in those pale eyes as they measured distances and angles with the precision of a surveyor. But it was the scars that confirmed Bradley's growing suspicion. As the lamplight caught the old man's gun hand, the deputy could see the telltale marks that spoke of decades handling hot metal and flying lead. 3 parallel lines across the knuckles where shrapnel had torn flesh. A puckered circle on the back of the hand where a bullet had passed clean through. Most distinctive of all, a jagged scar running from the base of the thumb to the wrist, the kind of wound that came from having a gun explode in your grip and continuing to fight anyway. "Sweet Jesus," Bradley whispered to himself, his newspaper forgotten as recognition crashed over him like a cold wave. Those scars, that stance, those eyes. His grandfather had described them in perfect detail during long winter evenings by the fireplace, stories of the man who had trained the most famous lawmen of the frontier. Bradley pushed back from his table with enough force to scrape the legs across the wooden floor, drawing curious glances from nearby patrons. He moved quickly but carefully toward Carver's table, his mind racing through everything his grandfather had told him about Samuel Rivers, the legendary instructor who had taught Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and Bat Masterson everything they knew about handling iron. The man who had personally killed more dangerous men than most lawmen faced in a lifetime, yet had disappeared from public view more than a decade ago. "Mr. Carver," Bradley called out as he approached the poker table, his voice tight with urgency. "Sir, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Perhaps we should all just calm down and—" Carver whirled on the young deputy with fury blazing in his eyes. "Misunderstanding," he snarled. "The only misunderstanding here is this old fool thinking he can cheat at my table and threaten me afterward. Deputy, unless you plan to arrest this man for disturbing the peace, I suggest you mind your own business." "But sir," Bradley persisted, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Carver's ears, "I think you should know who you are dealing with here. That man, I believe he might be. I do not care if he is Jesus Christ himself risen from the grave," Carver interrupted loudly. "He cheated, he threatened me, and now he is going to pay the consequences. The only thing I want to know about that broken-down saddle tramp is whether he wants to die standing up or crawling on his belly." Bradley's face went pale as he realized his warning was not only being ignored, but actively dismissed. He took several steps backward, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the butt of his service revolver, though he had no intention of drawing it. His grandfather's stories had been explicit about what happened to men who found themselves on the wrong side of Samuel Rivers' guns. The old man, meanwhile, had been listening to this exchange with the patient attention of someone who had heard similar conversations many times before. When Carver turned back to face him, Rivers reached down with deliberate slowness and adjusted his gun belt, the movement causing his ancient holster to shift and reveal more details of the weapon it contained. The Colt Peacemaker that emerged into view was indeed old, its blued steel worn to a dull gray in places where countless draws had polished the metal. But any man who knew firearms could see that this was not some neglected relic gathering dust in a drawer. Every surface gleamed with the care that came from decades of meticulous maintenance. The action had been smoothed by master gunsmiths until it operated with the precision of a fine watch. Most telling of all, carved into the well-worn grip in small, neat letters, were the initials W.E. Carver's eyes fixed on the revolver with the contempt of a man who believed newer always meant better. Lord Almighty, he laughed, his voice carrying across the now silent saloon. Would you look at that antique? Old-timer, that museum piece you are carrying looks even slower than its owner. I bet that relic has not been fired since Lincoln was president. The old man's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet enough that men had to strain to hear him, yet it carried to every corner of the saloon with perfect clarity. The tone was flat and emotionless, as cold as a tombstone in winter and twice as final. This gun, he said, his pale eyes never leaving Carver's face, retired Wyatt Earp from law enforcement. Wyatt himself told me that after I taught him everything he knew about drawing iron, he realized he would never be fast enough to beat his instructor. So he hung up his badge and found other ways to make his living. The silence that followed this statement was so complete that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like thunder. Deputy Bradley felt his knees go weak as his worst fears were confirmed. Several patrons who had been edging toward the exits now broke into outright runs for the door, while others pressed themselves against the walls as if trying to merge with the wood itself. But Diamond Jim Carver, blinded by his own arrogance and years of facing down men who were all bluff and no substance, heard only the ravings of a desperate old man trying to talk his way out of a beating. His laughter was harsh and mocking, echoing off the saloon walls like the sound of breaking glass. The old man watched Carver's mocking laughter with the same detached interest a scientist might show when observing a laboratory specimen. When the gambler's amusement finally subsided, Rivers spoke again, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man reciting established facts rather than making boastful claims. "My name is Samuel Rivers," he said, each word dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. 23 years ago, I ran the finest shooting academy west of the Mississippi. Every lawman worth his badge came to me to learn the difference between being fast and being alive. Deputy Bradley felt his grandfather's ghost standing beside him as those familiar stories took on flesh and blood reality. The young lawman's hand trembled as he reached for his notebook, some part of him wanting to record this moment for history, though he dared not take his eyes off the unfolding confrontation. Rivers continued in that same emotionless tone, his pale eyes fixed on Carver's increasingly uncertain face. Wyatt Earp spent 6 months at my ranch learning that speed meant nothing without accuracy and control. When he left, he could put 6 shots through a silver dollar at 20 paces, but more importantly, he understood that every bullet fired carried a man's life in its wake. Doc Holliday came to me after his first kill, shaking like a leaf and convinced he would never survive another gunfight. I taught him that fear keeps a man alive longer than confidence ever will. The gambler's 3 companions had begun exchanging nervous glances, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist under the desert sun. The largest of them, a thick-necked man named Briggs who worked as Carver's primary enforcer, took a barely perceptible step backward. His experience with violence had always involved overwhelming odds and intimidated victims, not facing down a man who spoke of legendary gunfighters as former students. "Bat Masterson was my finest pupil," Rivers went on, his weathered hands remaining perfectly still at his sides. "Stayed with me for 8 months and learned every trick I knew about reading an opponent's intentions before they even knew them themselves. When he finally faced down his first serious challenger, he was so thoroughly prepared that the fight was over before the other man realized it had begun." Carver's face had lost some of its earlier color, but his pride in years of successful intimidation kept him from backing down. Even if what you are saying is true, old man, and I have serious doubts about that, those days are long past. You are talking about things that happened decades ago. Even if you were once something special, time has a way of slowing a man down. Your pupils might have made names for themselves, but students often surpass their teachers. The observation was reasonable enough that several onlookers nodded unconsciously, but Rivers' expression never changed. He reached up with his left hand and removed his wire-rimmed spectacles, folding them carefully and slipping them into his vest pocket. Without the glasses, his pale blue eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire that made grown men uncomfortable to meet directly. You are right about time, Rivers acknowledged. It does slow a man down in some ways. My eyes are not as sharp as they once were, which is why I wear spectacles now. My joints ache on cold mornings, and I cannot ride as long or as hard as I did in my youth. But time also teaches lessons that no young man can understand. His voice dropped even lower, forcing everyone in the saloon to strain their ears to catch his words. In my active years, I faced down 43 men who fancied themselves gunfighters. 43 men who thought they were fast enough, smart enough, or lucky enough to put Samuel Rivers in the ground and claim his reputation for their own. Every single one of them learned the same lesson you are about to learn, that there is a world of difference between wanting to kill a man and being able to do it. The temperature in the saloon seemed to drop 10 degrees as the implications of that statement sank in. 43 men dead by his hand was a tally that exceeded the combined kills of most famous lawmen, a number that spoke of a level of deadly competence that belonged in whispered legends rather than face-to-face reality. Carver's hand had begun to tremble slightly, though whether from fear or rage was impossible to tell. His voice, when he found it, carried a note of desperate bluster. 43 men, he repeated. Big number for a man to remember so precisely. Most folks lose count after a certain point, unless they are keeping score for the sake of bragging. Rivers nodded once, as if acknowledging a fair point. I remember every name, every face, every circumstance that forced me to kill them. I remember because my wife made me promise that I would carry the weight of each death for the rest of my days. She said that forgetting would make me no better than a common murderer, and she was right. The mention of his wife brought the first trace of human emotion into the old man's voice, a note of pain that spoke of loss and regret. She made me promise something else as well, Rivers continued. On her deathbed, she asked me to hang up my guns and find a peaceful way to live out my remaining years. I gave her my word that I would never again seek out violence or provoke confrontations that could be avoided. Briggs, Carver's primary enforcer, took another step backward and bumped into one of his companions. The three men were now huddled together like sheep sensing wolves in the darkness, their earlier confidence replaced by the growing realization that they had stumbled into a situation far beyond their capabilities. But she also made me promise, Rivers said, his voice returning to its earlier flatness, that I would never allow innocent people to be harmed when I had the power to prevent it. She said that some promises were more important than personal peace, and that a man who refused to act when action was needed was no man at all. The old gunfighter's pale eyes swept over Carver and his three companions with the cold assessment of a butcher evaluating livestock. In each face, he read the signs he had learned to recognize decades ago, the slight dilation of pupils that indicated adrenaline, the unconscious shifting of weight that revealed intended movements, the telltale tightening of muscles that preceded a draw. Carver's face had gone from red to pale to a sickly green color that suggested his body was preparing for violence whether his mind was ready or not. His hand hovered near his gun but, trembling with the internal war between pride and survival instinct that had destroyed lesser men than he. So here is what is going to happen, Rivers said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. You and your friends are going to turn around and walk out of this saloon. You are going to leave Tombstone tonight and never return. You are going to find some other territory to work your schemes and prey on people too frightened or too weak to stand up to you. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Every man in the saloon understood that the next few seconds would determine whether they witnessed a peaceful resolution or the kind of violence that would be talked about in whispers for decades to come. Or, Rivers concluded, his weathered hand moving to rest lightly on his gun, but, You can choose to make this the night you join those 43 men who thought they were faster than time and wiser than experience. The choice, as always, is yours to make. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the Silver Dollar Saloon existed in perfect suspension between peace and violence. Carver's hand trembled above his gun, but while his three companions spread out in what they imagined was a tactical formation. Briggs moved to Rivers' left, while the other two men, Patterson and Kelly, attempted to flank him from the right. It was the kind of maneuver that had worked against frightened shopkeepers and intimidated farmers, but Rivers watched their positioning with the detached interest of a chess master observing novices stumble through their opening moves. The breaking point came when Carver's nerve finally snapped under the weight of those pale blue eyes boring into his soul. With a strangled cry that was half rage and half terror, the gambler clawed for his ivory-handled Remington, his movements jerky and desperate as panic overrode any semblance of proper technique. Rivers had been reading Carver's intentions for the past 30 seconds, watching the telltale signs that preceded violence. The slight forward lean of the shoulders, the unconscious shifting of weight to the balls of the feet, the minute dilation of pupils that indicated a man preparing to kill or die. When Carver finally committed to his draw, Rivers was already in motion, his weathered hand moving with the fluid precision of water flowing downhill. The contrast between the two draws was like comparing a thunderstorm to surgical steel. Carver's gun came up in a wild arc, his hand shaking so violently that his first shot went wide by 3 feet, shattering a whiskey bottle on the bar and sending amber liquid cascading to the floor. The sound of the gunshot was still echoing off the saloon walls when Rivers' Colt cleared leather with the whisper-quiet efficiency of long practice. Rivers' first shot was not fast in the manner that young gunfighters prized, but it carried the devastating accuracy that came from decades of experience. The bullet took Carver through the meat of his gun hand, precisely severing the tendons that controlled his trigger finger without shattering bone or causing permanent crippling. The gambler's Remington went flying across the room as he screamed and clutched his wounded hand to his chest, blood seeping between his fingers. Briggs, seeing his employer disabled, went for his own weapon with the lumbering determination of a man who had relied on size and intimidation rather than skill. His gun was a heavy dragoon Colt that had served him well in barroom brawls and back alley beatings, but drawing it from his shoulder holster required a series of movements that telegraphed his intentions like a semaphore flag. Rivers pivoted smoothly, his body moving with the balanced grace of a man who had spent years practicing these precise motions until they became as natural as breathing. His second shot caught Briggs' gun hand at the wrist, the bullet passing cleanly through flesh and muscle in a way that would heal properly with time, but rendered the hand immediately useless. Briggs' dragoon tumbled from nerveless fingers as the big man staggered backward, his face pale with shock and pain. Patterson and Kelly, the remaining 2 members of Carver's crew, had their weapons half drawn when they witnessed the surgical precision with which their companions had been neutralized. Patterson, a thin man with nervous eyes who carried a Navy Colt at his hip, froze with his gun barely clear of its holster. Kelly, younger and more impulsive, completed his draw but found himself staring down the barrel of Rivers' Peacemaker before he could bring his own weapon to bear. The old gunfighter's voice carried the same flat calm it had maintained throughout the confrontation. "Drop them," he said simply. "You are both still alive because you hesitated instead of committing fully to violence. Do not make the mistake of testing my patience further." Both men allowed their pistols to fall to the sawdust-covered floor with dull thuds that sounded unnaturally loud in the aftermath of gunfire. Patterson raised his hands above his head while Kelly stood frozen, his face white with the realization of how close he had come to joining the legendary 43. Rivers kept his Colt trained on the group while he conducted what appeared to be a professional assessment of the situation. His pale eyes moved from man to man, noting wound severity, threat potential, and psychological state with the clinical detachment of a battlefield surgeon. Carver was neutralized but not fatally wounded. Briggs would require medical attention but would recover full use of his hand with proper care. Patterson and Kelly were unharmed but thoroughly cowed. The sound of scraping would drew Rivers' attention back to Carver, who had dropped to his knees and was crawling toward the corner of the room with his good hand extended. There, Partially concealed behind an overturned chair, lay a small hideout gun that had apparently fallen from the gambler's vest during the initial confrontation. It was a two-shot Derringer, the kind of backup weapon that professional gamblers relied upon when their primary iron failed them. Rivers watched this desperate maneuver with the patience of a man who had seen every conceivable variation of human treachery. He made no move to stop Carver's crawling progress, instead holstering his peacemaker with deliberate slowness that demonstrated his complete confidence in the outcome of whatever the gambler was planning. Carver's fingers closed around the Derringer's grip with the desperate relief of a drowning man grasping a lifeline. He rolled onto his back, bringing the small weapon up toward Rivers with his uninjured left hand, his face twisted with pain and murderous intent. The range was less than 10 feet, close enough that even a wounded man with his offhand should have been able to score a hit on such a large target. But as Carver squeezed the trigger, Rivers simply stepped to his left with the minimal movement necessary to avoid the bullet's path. The Derringer's report was sharp and flat compared to the deeper boom of the Colt, and the bullet embedded itself harmlessly in the wooden wall behind where Rivers had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. Before Carver could fire the Derringer's second shot, Rivers drew and fired with movements so economical they seemed almost casual. His bullet struck the small gun precisely where the barrel met the frame, shattering the weapon and sending fragments of metal spinning away in all directions. The impact drove the broken Derringer from Carver's grasp, leaving him weaponless and utterly defeated. The gambler lay on his back in the sawdust, clutching his wounded hand and staring up at Rivers with the stunned expression of a man whose entire worldview had just collapsed around his ears. Blood continued to seep between his fingers, but the wound was clean and would heal without permanent damage if properly tended. Rivers stood over his defeated opponent, his Colt once again holstered and his hands hanging loose at his sides. When he spoke, his voice carried the tone of a teacher delivering a final lesson to a particularly slow student. "You shoot like you gamble, Carver," he said with matter-of-fact certainty. Sloppy, desperate, and without any understanding of the true stakes involved. You relied on intimidation and numbers because you never learned the discipline that separates professionals from pretenders. In cards and gunfighting alike, skill defeats luck every single time. Deputy Bradley, who had watched the entire confrontation from his corner table with the fascinated horror of a man witnessing legend become reality, finally found his voice. "Sweet merciful Lord," he whispered, his grandfather's stories pale compared to the surgical precision he had just witnessed. That was not gunfighting, that was artistry. The silence that followed the gunfight stretched for nearly a full minute before the first patron dared to move. Then, as if a dam had suddenly burst, the Silver Dollar Saloon erupted into a chaos of voices, movement, and barely contained excitement. Men who had pressed themselves against the walls during the confrontation now surged forward to get a closer look at the legendary Samuel Rivers, while others rushed to assist the wounded or simply to claim they had witnessed history in the making. Carver and his 3 associates required no encouragement to leave Tombstone. Briggs helped his wounded employer to his feet, while Patterson and Kelly gathered their scattered weapons with the shaking hands of men who understood how close they had come to death. Within minutes, the 4 men had stumbled out through the batwing doors and disappeared into the desert night, leaving behind only bloodstains in the sawdust and stories that would be told and retold for decades. Rivers himself seemed largely unaffected by the violence he had just dispensed. He calmly reloaded his peacemaker with practiced movements, replacing the spent cartridges with fresh ammunition from his gun belt. His pale blue eyes swept the crowd that had gathered around him, noting faces and assessing the mood of the room with the careful attention of a man who had learned never to assume that one confrontation meant the end of all danger. The bartender, a stout German immigrant named Klaus Weber who had served drinks through numerous frontier altercations, approached Rivers with a bottle of his finest whiskey and a clean glass. "Mr. Rivers," he said with heavily accented English, "this drink is on the house, and every drink you ever want in my establishment. What you did here tonight, protecting decent folk from those vultures, this is what makes a man worthy of respect." Rivers accepted the whiskey with a nod of gratitude, but barely touched it to his lips before setting it aside. The gesture was not one of rejection, but of a man whose mind was elsewhere, processing the weight of what had just occurred. He had broken his promise to his deceased wife about avoiding violence, even though the circumstances had left him no honorable alternative. Deputy Bradley approached with the reverence of a pilgrim visiting a sacred shrine. "Mr. Rivers," he began hesitantly, "I hope you do not mind my asking, but my grandfather used to tell me stories about the old days. He was a Texas Ranger back when the frontier was still truly wild, and he always spoke of you with the kind of respect men reserve for legends." Rivers turned his pale gaze toward the young lawman, studying him with the careful attention he gave to all potential threats. "Your grandfather would be?" he asked quietly. "Benjamin Bradley, sir. Ranger Bradley. He served under Captain McNelly during the border troubles with Mexico. Used to say that Samuel Rivers was the finest teacher of guncraft who ever lived, and that any man who learned from you came away not just faster with a gun, but wiser about when to use it and when to walk away." A flicker of recognition passed through Rivers' eyes, followed by something that might have been warmth. "Ben Bradley," he repeated softly. "Good man, your grandfather. Steady hands and a clear head in a crisis. He came to my ranch twice, once to learn and once to teach me a few things about reading trail sign that I had never picked up. How is old Ben doing these days?" Bradley's face fell slightly. "Passed on 2 years ago, sir. Pneumonia took him during a hard winter. But he spoke of you right up until the end, always wondering what had become of the man who taught legends how to shoot." Rivers was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands turning the whiskey glass slowly on the table. "Too many good men gone," he said finally. "Your grandfather was worth 10 of the men I faced down tonight, and men like him always seem to die in bed while the wolves die with their boots on. There is no justice in that, but there is a lesson if a man is wise enough to see it." The conversation continued for another hour as the saloon gradually emptied of curiosity seekers and returned to something approaching normalcy. Rivers answered Bradley's questions about the old days with the patient courtesy of a man who understood the importance of preserving history, though his responses revealed little about his own emotions and much about his respect for the men he had trained. When the clock struck midnight, Rivers finally rose from his chair and retrieved his battered hat from where it had fallen during the confrontation. "Deputy," he said to Bradley, "I would consider it a personal favor if the official report of tonight's events mentioned only that a disturbance was resolved without fatalities. Some stories are better left untold, especially when they might encourage young fools to come looking for reputation." Bradley nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, sir, Mr. Rivers. As far as the territorial government is concerned, Diamond Jim Carver and his associates decided to leave Tombstone for personal reasons unrelated to any criminal activity. 3 weeks later, the changes in Tombstone were already visible to anyone who cared to look. The high-stakes gambling that had drained money from honest ranchers and merchants had disappeared along with Carver and his crew. Small businesses that had been struggling under protection schemes began to prosper again. The saloons became places where working men could enjoy a drink and conversation without fear of being drawn into rigged games or manufactured confrontations. Rivers himself had taken up residence in a small house on the outskirts of town, a modest dwelling that suited his simple needs and allowed him to maintain the peaceful retirement he had promised his wife. He spent his days reading, tending a small garden, and occasionally accepting invitations to share meals with families whose lives had been improved by his intervention that night in the Silver Dollar. But word of what had happened spread through the frontier telegraph system of travelers, merchants, and drifters who carried news from town to town. The story grew in the telling, as such stories always did, but the core facts remained consistent. Samuel Rivers was alive, he had lost none of his legendary skill, and he was living quietly in Tombstone. 6 months after the confrontation, the first pilgrimage arrived. A young man named William Cody, barely 20 and already carrying himself with the swagger of someone who fancied himself a gunfighter, rode into Tombstone asking directions to Rivers' house. He had heard the stories in Denver and traveled 300 miles for the privilege of facing down the man who had trained Wyatt Earp. Rivers received the young challenger on his front porch with the weary patience of a man who had dealt with such visits many times before. He listened politely as Cody recited his credentials, his victories over other young guns, and his intention to make a name for himself by outdrawing a legend. When the recitation ended, Rivers responded with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Son," he asked in that same quiet voice that had chilled Carver's blood, "how many men have you killed in fair fights? Not wounded, not frightened away, not outdrawn without shooting. How many men have you actually killed?" Cody's confident expression faltered slightly. "Well, sir, I have never actually had to kill anyone. Most men back down when they see how fast I am, and the few who did not were not very skilled to begin with." Rivers nodded as if this answer confirmed what he had already suspected. "Then let me give you some free advice, young man. Go home to whatever family is waiting for you and find some other way to make your mark on the world. Killing men is not a game or a path to glory. It is a burden that grows heavier with each life taken, and the reputation you think you want will bring you nothing but more young fools like yourself looking to take it away from you." The conversation continued for an hour, with Rivers patiently explaining the realities of violence to a young man whose head had been filled with dime novel fantasies. By the end of their talk, Cody had abandoned his challenge and accepted Rivers' offer of a hot meal and a place to spend the night before beginning his journey home. As the months turned into years, such visits became routine. Young men arrived in Tombstone seeking the legendary Samuel Rivers, drawn by stories of his prowess and the romantic notion of testing themselves against the best. Almost all of them left without drawing their weapons, educated about the true cost of violence by a man who had paid that cost many times over. Those few who insisted on their challenges found themselves facing not the aged relic they expected, but a man whose decades of experience more than compensated for any loss of physical speed. Rivers never killed these challengers, but his surgical precision with a gun ensured that none of them left Tombstone with any illusions about their own abilities or any desire to continue their careers as aspiring gunfighters. The territorial authorities took notice of the unusual peace that had settled over Tombstone and the surrounding region. Crimes of violence decreased dramatically, not because of increased law enforcement, but because word had spread that Samuel Rivers would not tolerate predators operating in his vicinity. The mere possibility of facing the legendary instructor was enough to send most troublemakers looking for easier prey in other territories. Deputy Bradley, who had been promoted to town marshal partly based on his connection to Rivers, often consulted with the old gunfighter about matters of law enforcement. These conversations took place on Rivers' front porch in the evenings, with the marshal seeking advice about handling situations that required more subtlety than force. It was during one of these evening talks, nearly 2 years after the confrontation in the Silver Dollar, that Bradley asked the question that had been troubling him since that first night. "Mr. Rivers," he began carefully, "do you ever regret the path your life took? I mean, all those men you had to kill, all the violence you witnessed and participated in." Rivers was quiet for so long that Bradley began to wonder if he had overstepped some boundary. Finally, the old gunfighter spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent contemplating the same question. "Every man I killed was trying to kill me or someone I was sworn to protect," he said slowly. "Every shot I fired was in defense of life and law. But that does not make the burden any lighter to carry. I see their faces sometimes in my dreams, young men mostly who chose the wrong path and paid the ultimate price for that choice. I regret that circumstances forced those confrontations, but I do not regret the outcomes." He paused to light his pipe, a ritual that had become familiar to Bradley during their conversations. The marshal waited patiently, knowing that Rivers was organizing his thoughts with the same precision he applied to everything else. "What I regret most," Rivers continued, "is that my reputation became a magnet for exactly the kind of young fools I spent my career trying to discourage. Every man I trained, every story that was told about my abilities, created more young men who thought they could build their own legends by facing down Samuel Rivers. In trying to create better lawmen, I inadvertently created more problems for myself and for society." The conversation drifted into other topics as the desert night settled around them, but Bradley carried those words with him for the rest of his career in law enforcement. Years later, when he had become a respected territorial judge, he would often repeat Rivers' observations about the unintended consequences of legend-making to young lawyers and lawmen who sought his guidance. 5 years after the night in the Silver Dollar Saloon, Rivers received news that brought both sadness and closure to a chapter of his life. Wyatt Earp had been killed in a gunfight in Kansas, not by a faster gun, but by a shotgun blast from ambush as he walked down a dark street. The telegram from Dodge City was brief and factual, but Rivers understood the implications immediately. He spent that evening sitting by his wife's grave in the small cemetery outside Tombstone, talking to her headstone as if she could hear every word. The conversation was one-sided but necessary, a ritual he had developed for processing the major events of his continuing life. "Martha," he said to the weathered granite marker, "Wyatt is gone. Killed by cowards who did not have the courage to face him straight up. All those lessons I taught him about reading situations and watching for danger, and in the end it did not matter. Sometimes skill and preparation are not enough against treachery and overwhelming odds." The desert wind stirred the sagebrush around the cemetery, the only sound in the vast silence that stretched toward the distant mountains. Rivers pulled his coat tighter against the evening chill and continued his report to his deceased wife. "I have been thinking about the promise you made me give, about hanging up my guns and finding peace. I kept that promise as well as any man could, but I broke it when circumstances forced my hand. I hope you understand that some principles matter more than personal promises, and that protecting innocent people was always more important to you than my own safety or peace of mind." 10 years had passed since the confrontation when Rivers began to notice that his visits to town drew different kinds of attention. Children who had been infants when he faced down Diamond Jim Carver were now old enough to recognize him and point him out to their friends. Adults spoke his name with the reverence usually reserved for historical figures rather than living men. The transformation troubled him because it represented exactly what he had hoped to avoid when he retired from active gunfighting. He was becoming a living legend, a figure of such mythic proportions that young men would continue seeking him out long after his physical abilities had declined to the point where he could no longer defend himself or others effectively. It was this realization that prompted his decision to leave Tombstone for a final time. On a cool morning in October, 15 years after he had first arrived in the town as a nameless drifter, Samuel Rivers loaded his few possessions into a wagon and prepared to disappear once again into the anonymity he had sought since his wife's death. Deputy Marshal Bradley, now grown gray at the temples and wise in the ways of frontier justice, came to see him off. The two men had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of the complexities inherent in maintaining law and order in a civilization still finding its footing. "Where will you go?" Bradley asked as Rivers checked the harness on his horse for the final time. Rivers smiled, the first genuinely warm expression the marshal had seen cross his weathered features in all their years of acquaintance. "Somewhere quiet, where the name Samuel Rivers means nothing to anyone. Somewhere I can live out whatever time remains to me without young fools showing up on my doorstep looking for glory or redemption." The wagon rolled out of Tombstone as the sun crested the eastern mountains, carrying with it one of the last authentic legends of the American frontier. Rivers never returned to the town that had been briefly blessed and permanently changed by his presence, but his influence continued to shape the community for generations. 25 years after that October morning, an elderly Tom Bradley sat in his judge's chambers in the territorial capital, dictating his memoirs to a young clerk who had been born long after the frontier had been tamed and civilized. The stories he told about Samuel Rivers had been refined by decades of retelling, but their essential truth remained unchanged. "If you want to understand what made the frontier different from what came after," Bradley dictated slowly, "you have to understand men like Samuel Rivers. They were not the gunfighters of dime novels or the sanitized heroes of popular fiction. They were complicated men who carried terrible burdens and made impossible choices because someone had to make them. They taught us that true strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to know when destruction is necessary and when mercy serves justice better than violence." The clerk, a young man named Harrison who had grown up in Boston and come west to seek adventure in the law, paused in his writing to ask a question that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the frontier experience. "But Judge Bradley," he said earnestly, "surely you do not approve of vigilante justice or taking the law into one's own hands. Civilization depends on established legal procedures and institutional authority." Bradley was quiet for a moment, remembering a night 25 years earlier when institutional authority had been represented by one young deputy, facing 4 armed men intent on violence. He thought of Samuel Rivers calmly reloading his peacemaker while wounded men bled in the sawdust, and of the peace that had followed in the wake of that controlled violence. "Young man," he said finally, "civilization is a luxury that requires someone to pay for it. On the frontier, that payment was often made in blood by men who understood that sometimes the law exists in the space between one man's conscience and another man's trigger finger." Samuel Rivers was not a vigilante. He was the law incarnate, carrying justice in his holster because no institution existed yet that could deliver it more effectively. The dictation session ended soon afterward, but Bradley sat alone in his chambers for another hour, remembering the sound of gunfire in the Silver Dollar Saloon and the sight of a legend methodically destroying 4 men's lives without killing any of them. It had been, he realized, a perfect demonstration of controlled violence in service of justice, the kind of moral precision that defined the best men of their generation. 40 years after leaving Tombstone, in a small cabin beside a mountain stream whose name appeared on no map, Samuel Rivers died peacefully in his sleep. He was found 3 days later by a trapper who had known him only as Sam, a quiet neighbor who helped with heavy work and told stories about the old days that seemed too detailed and personal to be second-hand accounts. The trapper buried him beside the stream according to written instructions found in Rivers' effects, placing a simple wooden marker that bore only his name and the dates of his birth and death. There was no mention of his legendary status, no catalog of his achievements, and no indication that the man resting in that unmarked grave had helped shape the destiny of the American frontier. But in Tombstone, now a prosperous town with electric lighting and a railroad connection to the outside world, old timers still gathered in the Silver Dollar Saloon to tell stories about the night Samuel Rivers faced down Diamond Jim Carver and changed the course of their community's history. The details had grown and shifted over the decades, but the essential truth remained. When evil men threatened innocent people, a good man with superior skills had stood up and delivered justice with precision, mercy, and deadly effectiveness. And if you enjoyed this tale of hidden legends and the price of justice in the Old West, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, honor, and the complex men who shaped America's frontier. We bring you these tales of moral certainty in uncertain times because the principles they represent remain as relevant today as they were in the dusty streets of Tombstone. Until next time, may you find the courage to stand when standing is required, and the wisdom to know when mercy serves justice better than revenge.